Hello again, everyone. So we're finally on the last module of Chapter 7, which has to do with intelligence. And if we look at our review guide, you will see that there are 7 different things from this module that you will need to know for the next exam. They go relatively quickly. I'll also say that one of them is the answer, in a sense, is already provided for you in the review guide, but I'm going to go over it anyway. But let's get right into it and talk about intelligence. So we're going to talk about first what intelligence is. And there's so many different ways to define intelligence. For the sake of this exam, though, we're going to go by how the book defines it. And so in our psychology book, it is defined as the capacity to think and reason clearly and to act purposefully and effectively, and adapting to the environment and pursuing one's goal. A big thing to remember about that is adapting to the environment. Because you'll see so many times that when we talk about intelligence, we're essentially talking about how someone is able to survive in their environment, whether, they have to use book smarts, street smarts, musical ability, athletic ability, anything like that. A lot of time it's looking at surviving in the environment. And so when you're able to use, your knowledge and to think and to act purposefully and effectively, you're using intelligence. Another example is the global capacity of the individual to act purposefully, to think rationally, and to deal effectively with the environment. So again, that kind of interaction with the environment. But one quote that I love, and you might have also heard it before, is by Albert Einstein. He said, "Everybody is a genius, but if you judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, it will live its whole life believing that it is stupid." And this is something very, very big when it comes to education and when it comes to being in a school. And if there is one thing that I could say to you all, it's that each and every one of you is very, very smart. And a lot of times you don't realize it. But every day when I've gotten to read your journals, and even being able to read them now, the intelligence that you guys have, the creative thoughts, just the abilities that you guys have blow me away every single day. And there are so many students out there, and just people in general, that don't realize just how smart they are because they're defining their intelligence by something that's just not them. Like, a fish's ability to climb a tree. Being able to climb a tree is not the one way of defining intelligence. So even though this is the way that we are defining intelligence for the sake of this class, no, and you will see, there are so many different ways. But how do we measure intelligence? Because of course, and especially me as a special educator, there must be a way to kind of standardize, and I'll talk about in a little bit more what I mean by that, but to standardize intelligence. And a way to measure it so it is, universal, I guess is another way to put it. And the first kind of way that we came up with this, or that people did this, is what is known as an intelligence quotient, also known as IQ, which you might have heard of before. And this is something that you will need to know for the exam, and you just need to know the equation for calculating your IQ. And essentially what it is you take your mental age. So, your ability in math, reading, writing, athletics, anything like that. The mental age. And you divide that by how old you actually are, and then take that and multiply it by 100. So let's say that you are 10 years old, and you actually have the mental age of a 12-year-old. It would be 12 divided by 10, and then you multiply that by 100. And then that would be your IQ. Now this has changed kind of over time. You had Binet and Simon that utilized only the mental age and actual age. So they weren't really looking at your IQ. They weren't trying to come up with a score. It was more just looking at how you personally varied from, your mental age versus your actual age. Then you had Lewis Terman, who revised it, and it's now called the Stanford-Binet Intelligence Scale, and that is one that is used to this day. But kind of the more commonly used one, and the one that I see used, again as a special educator with the school psychologist, is the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale, and then the Wechsler Intelligence Scale for children. But it all uses kind of the same idea. Instead of IQ scale for the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale, there's something known as the Full Scale IQ. But it breaks down intelligence into so much more, and you'll see what I mean in the next few slides. But first you heard me say that there had to be a way to standardize intelligence, and this has to do with what are known as standardized tests. And what we mean when we say that it is standardized, and this is the next thing that you will need to know, is it's a way of measuring it, so again, it's universal. If you get a score of, 10, and, we go to a completely different school and somebody else gets this, the score of 10, we know that it's the same 10. And the reason why we do standardization is, let's say that we're trying to make sure that schools are doing what they're supposed to do. And this is, in a sense, why we have standardized tests. We want to make sure that schools are preparing students for the future. And so we look at specific things, what subjects are important, let's say, reading, math, and government. And so we make these tests. And these tests are given to every single student at every single school in every single state. And it's so, if one school gets a score of, 100 on it, and then another school gets a score of 50, we know, okay, this school seems to be teaching it, or teaching what needs to be known. Maybe they're using a different technique that seems to be working better versus the other school. If every school had its own different tests, it could be that, every single school gets a 100, but, one test could be way easier than another. And so we standardize it. Excuse me. Another thing that you will need to know, so standardization, again, it's a way of establishing a norm. It's coming up with, something that is universal, that's the same throughout. There's also something we know is reliable. So a test being reliable and a test being valid. And for this one, we're going to come to me. Da-da-da-da! Alright, because the best way of explaining reliable versus valid is with a bullseye. So I'm going to make a very, very badly drawn bullseye. So here we go. Let me make sure I don't get the glare. So when something is reliable, it means that you get the same thing over and over and over again. The way that I always describe it is, think of a reliable boyfriend or girlfriend, a reliable brother or sister, a reliable significant other, parent, what have you. If it's someone that's reliable, it means that you know that when you need them, they will be there every single time. They're reliable. So reliable means that you get the same thing over and over and over again. Valid, on the other hand, means that it's actually doing what it's supposed to do. It's measuring what it's supposed to measure. So the reason why I do a bullseye is you can have something that is reliable but not valid, but you cannot have something that is valid and not reliable. In a sense, yes, okay. Let me just explain what I mean. Let's say that I'm shooting some arrows, and they all end up around here, and I'm aiming for a bullseye. I did not make it to the bullseye. But, it was all grouped together. This is an example of something that is reliable, but not valid. So, I'm shooting the same way over and over and over again, but it's not going where it's supposed to. So it's not valid, but it's reliable. Then, say I'm doing this. I'm shooting all over the place. So it's not reliable, because I cannot guarantee where my next arrow is going to hit. It's also not valid. And this kind of helps to explain how you can't really have something that's valid but not reliable, because it would have to be, where it's supposed to be. So then finally we have both reliable and valid. There we go. Would be, if you're over and over and over again, hitting right there in the center. That is an example of something that is both valid and reliable. It's valid because it's hitting where it's supposed to hit, and it's reliable because it's hitting there consistently. So I always like using the bullseye example for reliability and validity. You will need to know the difference between those two for the exam. Another quick example, but I'm going to go ahead and bring this back up so you can actually see the definition. Another example is, let's say that, I want to measure your intelligence, since we're talking about intelligence. And so I take your temperature. I use a thermometer. I'm like, I'm going to use this thermometer to test your intelligence. And so, they take your temperature, 98.6. Okay? I'm going to take your temperature again. Huh? Yeah, 98.6. Over and over and over again, that thermometer, if it's a good thermometer, is going to give the same reading. So it's reliable. But is temperature a valid way of measuring intelligence? No. So things can be reliable and not valid, but something cannot be valid without being reliable. So just food for thought. And this happens a lot where people will take a intelligence test and they'll get a result and they'll say, oh, you're a genius. And then another day you'll take that same test and it'll give you completely different results. That is not a valid test. And it's also not reliable. It's giving you different results. And there's a lot of tests out there that people will take. There's fun little ones. We're going to do a little one in your activities on Schoology that looks at your intelligence. And it should be taken with a grain of salt. But for the sake of this class, just knowing the difference between reliable and validity is important. And then we also have something known as cultural bias. This is something that is huge. It is still an issue to this day, and it's part of the reason why you see different standardized tests coming out. I mean, you guys have had the PARC, now it is known as the MCAP. I'm sure in a few years it'll be called something else. We're constantly updating these tests, not only as we learn, but also to help combat something known as cultural bias. And this is the whole idea that even when you make a standardized test, the way that the questions are worded is sometimes biased towards one culture versus another. I remember a teacher talking about how on a test there was a question about the amount of butter needed for lobster. And for a lot of people, on the Eastern Shore, people that live near the coast, they might understand what a lobster is. But, people living in the middle of the country might have never heard of what a lobster is. And so, they might not know, roughly speaking, how much butter is usually used for a lobster. And so that's just an example of a cultural bias, where some questions, even though they're trying their best to not be cultural biased, some people will have more background knowledge than others, and so they'll naturally do better than others. And that's not fair when you're trying to make something standardized. All right. Moving on. And this is just something you will learn more if you take a statistics class. Psychology is all about statistics, but this is just a normal distribution. And as far as intelligence is concerned, when looking just at IQ, which we'll talk about more, there's these things known as standard deviations, but essentially anything that is one standard deviation is considered kind of average. Then you spread out to a second deviation, and you'll see kind of the IQ scores. When you get to 3 standard deviations and below, or 3 standard deviations and above, that's when it's kind of more, I don't want to say abnormal, because I don't think that is the culturally appropriate way to say it, but it's when you start getting into people have intellectual disabilities, and also people that are kind of savants or geniuses. So gender differences when it comes to cognitive ability. There was a person known as David Halpern, and he's found that there is no evidence to support the belief that one sex is smarter than the other. However, it has been found that males outperform females in some visual spatial skills. However, females have no less ability in math than males, but there is a difference in confidence levels. And this is something where, again, I'm going to go on a very, very small tangent. So I'm going to bring myself back, at least in the corner. Hello. And there was a study that was done, and this has to do with the self-fulfilling prophecy, where there were two groups of individuals. It was two groups of females, and they were brought into a room, and one group was given an article all about how the female brain is different from the male brain when it comes to mathematical ability. Complete BS article, but they didn't know that. It was written as if it was, science research, yada yada. And then they did a math test. The other group, and I'm sorry, I said that a little bit wrong. It was males and females in each group. The other group, it was just a completely random article. Had nothing to do with intelligence, just random article. And then after that, the group would also take a math test. It was found that in the group where they got an article about how female brains, were different when it came to mathematical abilities, it was found that the males performed better than the females. When you looked at the group that had kind of an arbitrary article, it was found that there was no difference. And so this is the idea of the self-fulfilling prophecy. If you are told that you are not going to be good at something, if you hear, that you're not as good as, someone else, sometimes just hearing it can bring that out. It has more to do with confidence than actual ability. And so what happens is, someone's sitting there and they've just been told that, females aren't as good as math as others. It's a fact. They sit there and, they start stressing out about it and like, oh my God, I'm not going to be able to do this. And just that stress, that lack of confidence affects their performance. But I can tell you right here, right now, there is no difference in mathematical ability or any other ability by gender. So never let someone tell you that. You are able to do whatever you want to do to your own ability. So please remember that. But that's just a little thing about cognitive abilities. The differences, some of it also psychosocial. So again, it's what you're taught in your society has such an impact. But knowing that makes the impact less. So now you guys know that. So don't let what society tells you can do put you in a box. But there's other differences as well. Alright, and then I talked about the extremes of intelligences. This goes back to that standard deviation curve. But this is just something that sometimes individuals like special educators such as myself interact with, and these are just individuals where their IQ scores are 3 or more or 3 or less standard deviations from the norm. And so you have mild level of intellectual disability, moderate, severe, and profound. And depending on the capabilities, though you should never, again, understanding the capabilities, but always pushing for more when you can, I think is important. As special educators, a lot of times we don't give students as much credibility as they deserve. But that's a whole nother thing for another day. But, I mean, when you get to profound level of intellectual disability, it's when, they really do need to be supervised in order to function. But to never stop working with someone, never stop, helping give them the resources and the accommodations they need to have a fulfilling life. But anyway, those are just some of the extremes. And then we talk about Spearman. Let's see. This is another thing that you will need to know. Spearman had this whole idea, because up until now, we've just been talking about intelligence is just this score. It's just this number that defines your intelligence. That is a bunch of BS. It gives us a little bit of a picture, but it does not give us the full picture. And so Spearman came around, and he had this idea of the G factor, and it's your general intelligence. But he believed that there were other factors as well. And so you had this kind of general intelligence, which was comprised of other factors that made it up. So you will need to remember, not only on this exam, but also on the final exam, that Charles Spearman is the one who created this idea of the G factor. And the way that I always remember it is I think of spearmint gum. So spearmint, gum, Spearman, G factor. And then we also had Louis Thurston, and he had this idea that there were seven general or primary mental abilities. So instead of just having this IQ score, and instead of just saying, okay, there's this general intelligence and there's things that make it up, Thurston believed that there were 7 things. So you had your verbal comprehension, so understanding what people say, numerical ability, so kind of that math smart, your memory ability, do you have good memory or bad memory, inductive reasoning, so being able to kind of think for yourself to make inductions, perceptual speed, so how quickly you can come to these conclusions, verbal fluency, so how well you can, speak and articulate yourself, and then spatial relations, so being good with maps, things like that. And he believed that there was a combination of these where, you can be really good with numbers, but not so good of a memory. Having good perceptual speed, but maybe your verbal comprehension isn't that well. It was the whole idea that it's not just this one number, it's this combination of things. And then we get to Gardner, who had a similar idea, but for him it was 8. And so you'll see there's interpersonal, intrapersonal, linguistic, logical, mathematical, naturalistic, spatial, bodily, kinesthetic, and musical. And the thing to focus on, because you will have a question about it on the exam, is interpersonal, because a lot of times interpersonal is mixed up with intrapersonal. Interpersonal is your people skills. So how good are you at sympathizing with others, showing empathy, understanding other people's points of view? So, if you want to be a therapist, a social worker, a psychologist, jobs like that, you would need to have high interpersonal skills. So knowing that is important for the next exam. And I believe the quiz that I found for you guys to do, because I found a multiple intelligence quiz, I believe it follows Gardner, just going off of the results that I got. And you'll just answer some questions, and it will tell you kind of where your strength may lie. Again, it's not a standardized test. It's not the most reliable. It's more just a fun one to kind of see your skills. So you'll see that on Schoology. It'll just be very, very quick. I think it's no more than 10 questions, and then it tells you which one you have, and that's it. Just a fun little thing to show how there's different ways of defining your intelligence. And then we have Sternberg. I talked about Sternberg once before when we talked about the psychology of love, and how Sternberg was obsessed with triangles because he always had triarchic theories. So he had the triarchic theory of love. He also has the triarchic theory of intelligence. And so you will need to know about Sternberg for the exam, and to know that Sternberg was, again, triarchic. He had 3 main things. You have your practical intelligence, your creative intelligence, and then your analytic intelligence. So kind of the knowledge you have, kind of more just your understanding, math, reading, writing, all of that, being able to apply that knowledge, and then being able to think creatively. He thought that those 3 kind of major components made up intelligence, and then in each of those 3 it kind of broke down. But if you remember Sternberg, and that Sternberg had 3 main theories of intelligence, you will be golden. And so this just kind of goes over some of the major people when it came to talking about intelligence. Again, Spearman was the one with that G factor, so think spearmint gum. You had Thurston, which had 7 primary ones. Gardner, that had those 8. And then Sternberg, that had the 3. And then just one final thing has to go back to something we've talked about a few times in this class, which is the whole argument of nature versus nurture. And, when it comes to intelligence, how much of it is kind of predetermined? How much of it is in your genes? If you have smart parents, are you, predisposed to be smart yourself? If you have not so smart parents, are you going to be not so smart yourself? And the research out there, again, is similar to any of the research out there for anything for nature versus nurture. There is some evidence that shows that intelligence of some sort has a genetic component to it, but it is not 100%. And so, while there is some evidence for both nature and nurture, the thing to take home is what I always say, and what I said at the beginning of this video, is that your intelligence is not just defined by one thing. We are still to this day debating intelligence and how we define it. I think that in the education system, we still don't define it as well as we could. Because your athletic abilities, your artistic abilities, a lot of times that is overshadowed by other forms of intelligence. And I think as far as the world is concerned, every single form of intelligence is just as important as the other. So keep that in mind. Don't let, if people are better in one form of intelligence than you, always know that you are better at another form of intelligence than them. We're all different. We're all learning. And we are all wonderful. But that is it for Chapter 7. And I know this went on a little bit longer than I meant to, and I apologize. I went on some tangents. But that will be it for Module 7.3 and for Chapter 7. And so when we come back, we'll be going into Chapter 8.